war, intense state of repression. Contemporary Haiti has problems with gang violence. And then, of course, there was natural disasters, including the 2010 massive earthquake, followed by a massive cholera epidemic. So there's lots of different kind of intersecting forms of violence and disasters that are of interest to scholars of political violence. Haiti is also sort of an interesting case from the perspective of gender inequality. On the one hand, there are high levels of intimate partner violence. Haiti is, by most indices, highly gender unequal in terms of literacy rates and maternal mortality and things like this. But then also in Haiti, there are a number of gangs in the Port-au-Prince area that have a large number of women, and in fact there are a number of female-only gangs that operate in Port-au-Prince that we're particularly interested in studying, that really haven't been studied in any kind of depth. There are also women in local level politics, although even though Haiti has a gender quota for national level politics, they have not yet reached that quota. In fact, there are very few women who serve in the Haitian parliament. And on the super micro level, women are, based on a number of recent surveys, women really control the household. Most households in Haiti that really haven't been studied in any kind of depth. So sort of interesting, if you're curious about sort of gender inequality, there's all kinds of interesting ways these things intersect. Lastly, as a scholar of political violence, I was kind of surprised to learn as I've started on this project that Haiti is just dramatically understudied by political scientists, which is, I think, a real shame. So one thing that we want to contribute with this work is to try to use some of the methods that scholars have used in places like Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Uganda in a country within our own hemisphere. So what we plan to do is write really 3 separate papers using the survey instrument. So that's really what I'm going to be talking about today. I want to say this is not part of a larger book project, but these are really 3 distinct papers, and they reflect, I think, some of our own biases in terms of what we're most interested in. My expertise is on gender and violence, Danielle's is on political organizations and perceptions of legitimacy, so you can see how these kind of blend together. The first paper, and I'll talk through each of these individually on the next few slides, but the first paper will be focused on kind of a broad IR-related question, which is on who supports war and why. And we're looking at Haiti, and this is where the kind of little survey that we're going to be doing in South Africa will also help us examine some of the external validity from our findings in Haiti. Second, we want to write a paper that looks at the intersection of gangs, gender, and legitimacy in Haiti. First, by asking questions about which actors are seen as legitimate. Haiti is largely understood as a failed state. Gangs serve many functions. They, of course, perform a lot of violence, but can serve many functions, including things like garbage cleanup in some of the neighborhoods in Port-au-Prince. So we're interested in who's perceived to be legitimate. And as a kind of gender-related secondary question, does the gender composition of the various armed actors that are involved in different neighborhoods in Haiti actually affect people's perceptions of how legitimate these groups are? So another way of saying that is, if one of the gangs that operates in your community is a gang that has a lot of female members, or one of these all-female gangs, does that mean that you perceive them as perhaps more legitimate or less legitimate than the other kinds of gangs? And third is a paper that looks at violence and what's often termed pro-social outcomes. And this reflects on a set of studies mostly coming out of behavioral economics and some political science research that looks at some of the positive benefits of being exposed to largely wartime violence. And so one of the things that I think have been overlooked in this literature is about gender differences. Do men and women sort of experience these pro-social benefits in different kinds of ways? So the sample that we'll be looking at in Haiti, first and foremost, is a set of household surveys in some of the most violence-affected areas in Port-au-Prince. And this includes some of the neighborhoods that you might have heard of, Cité Soleil and Bel Air, which are often sort of notorious for having being very violent in terms of gangs. We're aiming to talk to about 1,000 different respondents, and given how things go, we might also do a nationally representative sample, although doing such a sample in Haiti presents a number of logistical challenges, and we're not sure we yet have the funding to do that. We're going to supplement this also with a small survey in South Africa in a township near Cape Town as well. So that's the sample for that study. So turning to talk about each of these papers a bit more, the paper that I circulated, sort of a shell of a paper, is for this first one here about the international relations question, about who supports war and why. First is kind of an empirical question, which is something that is really talked about in a lot of the international relations literature on support for war, which is that there's a very persistent gender gap, which is to say women are persistently less supportive of war being seen as justified. They are less supportive of defense spending, less supportive of the use of force. And if you look at particular kinds of weapons, such as drones, there are enormous gender gaps with drones in particular. So, but all of these questions so far have been fielded really in the global north and more precisely in the United States and in Western Europe. So what we've often treated in the literature as something that's kind of a constant and a universal, we really don't know if that's true. There are big gaps in our knowledge because we really haven't asked these kinds of questions to the entire bottom half of the globe. The second question we want to explore is, assuming that there is a gender gap also in Haiti, or even if there's not, we want to sort of explore what attitudes about support for war are associated with. And so one of the kind of main theories about why we see this gender gap is simply that women are different from men, right? Women could be because of biological reasons are different from men, perhaps because women are more likely to espouse what we might term feminist views or views about gender equality. We also want to examine whether people's personal experiences with violence in the Haitian context affect their attitudes and beliefs about their support for the justifiability of war and violence. And then finally, look at people's kind of personal stakes in war and violence as well. Our contribution with this paper, what we aim to do is to kind of address this gap again about how we really haven't fielded these questions in developing countries. And many developing countries are also more recently directly affected by war and conflict. And so that's another kind of big gap in this literature. If we only survey populations in the United States, not very many of us are directly affected by war and conflict. So to try to understand what the scope of the gender gap might be, to try to explore some of its limits. We will ask a set of kind of standard IR questions about war being justified, force being used to resolve a set of problems, etc. One thing we're kind of exploring, sort of pushing the limits of some of this literature, is that in much of this literature, in fact, I might even venture to say nearly all of this literature, sex is just seen as a binary, right? Men versus women. And of course, we understand sex and gender to be much more complicated than that. That is not yet reflected in the way we currently conduct our public opinion polls. So one of the things that we wanted to explore is kind of playing with some of these ideas in the Haitian context, is to, rather than asking people sort of how they identify, we will use something that's been used in a lot of the psychology literature, which is a sex role inventory. So essentially giving people a list of about 20 characteristics, things like, are you a dominant personality? How would you describe yourself? Do you like children? This particular, the sex role inventory that's most widely used was developed in the 70s. It's a little bit stereotypical, but it hasn't really been used in this kind of way before. So we want to try to test, for example, if more masculine men and more masculine women have similar views on the justifiability of the use of force than do more feminine men and more feminine women. Hope that makes sense. Happy to answer more questions about that. In paper 2, we want to explore again questions of gang violence, gender, and legitimacy. In particular, what kinds of actors have legitimacy in a failed state like Haiti? And second, are people's responses to these sorts of questions associated with their sex, with their political ideology, with their levels of education? We also want to do some priming as part of the survey to ask whether people's answers change if we make direct reference to, for example, there are all women's gangs that operate in this area. And then to try to see if that changes their answers to things like, is gang violence necessary for peace, can gangs be trusted, etc. And our contribution here, we hope, is to try to understand more about the roles of various actors in this kind of gray area of a security context, and also how gender might interact with that. Finally, we want to respond to a growing body of literature coming out of behavioral economics and some of the political violence research that really largely has the same finding, which is that exposure to violence is not all negative. That, in fact, in a variety of different contexts in lots of different countries, scholars have found that when people are exposed to wartime killing, if someone in your family has died, or if you grew up in an area that had a relatively large number of killings during a conflict, this seems to increase your pro-social behaviors and attitudes. So people seem to be more likely to vote, more likely to give to charity, more likely to be altruistic during lab in the field games, and maybe more likely to express trust in other people. The problem, I think, of a lot of this literature, I was sort of surprised as I was reviewing some of this previous work coming out of economics, is that it tends to use the ACLED data on killing. So this means that it's not necessarily about your personal experiences with violence, but rather whether you, in your region, there was a lot of killing, which I think sort of misses, again, there's a real opportunity to contribute to the micro level knowledge, rather than just if you happen to grow up in an area that was affected by a lot of violence. There are, again, a number of other really fascinating open questions that we hope to explore with this survey. Much of the literature is focused on killing, but what about non-lethal forms of violence? My other project was on rape and sexual violence, so does exposure to rape, if someone in your family was raped, for example, does this have the same kind of pro-social benefits? I have reason to doubt that that's true, but it's sort of an interesting hypothesis. And similarly, what about war-related violence and injuries? Again, in Haiti, we have the cholera epidemic and the earthquake. If someone in your family died as a result of the earthquake or was sick and died as a result of cholera, do you see these pro-social benefits? We have no idea, right? This hasn't really been explored in the literature, so that's something we want to explore. Similarly, looking at gender differences, and then asking people about whether the perpetrator makes a difference. So not just was someone in your family killed, but who were they killed by? All right. And then we'll ask about, we're not planning on doing any kind of lab in the field stuff, but we want to ask people about their self-reported behavior. So asking a battery of questions about whether they voted in the elections that just took place in December, how often they attend church or other kinds of religious services, whether they donate their time or money to charity and that sort of thing, so we can compare, again, across these various personal histories. Again, what I've sort of presented is we're at the stage of, we've developed a survey instrument. Our survey instrument is currently winding its way through Harvard's IRB. But we're at a stage of this project where we are very open to critiques and comments and feedback about other things that we might explore using these variables that I've just described. If people have kind of ideas about different ways of approaching these questions, we're very open to it, as well as any critiques or thoughts for extensions for the project. Thank you.
By radical feminists, and radical feminists were really skeptical of the use of the state because the state was sometimes seen as actually being the means of violence against women, and also skepticism about how that message might be co-opted. And so some of the very early efforts were not aimed at changing policies, it was more at providing shelter and services and crisis centers and changing societal values, so kind of take back the night marches and so on and so forth. And so this shift to using the state and using international organizations was seen as potentially having some downfalls. And some of those critiques coincide with some of the critiques we've seen in terms of those levied at human rights more broadly. One, that in the development of human rights mechanisms, that there have sometimes been inequalities in the process. Arguments, particularly by post-colonial critical scholars, feminists as well, that international organizations are dominated by hegemonic powers and the global inequalities that exist in the world more broadly are replicated in some of the institutions. That the documents themselves tend to reflect Western policies, and so focus on individual rights rather than group rights, and that could potentially be asymmetries and inequalities in the implementation. And so, one of the things a lot of my research is focused on kind of the difference between adopting a policy and actually implementing it, and the problematic implementation that happens. And so some of the critiques or the wariness was how would human rights documents be employed? Who are they targeted at? Who are seen as being the violators of human rights policies? And who does the employment of these human rights actually end up helping? And so, so these were all issues that were raised. And something that we kind of see as being kind of an ongoing problem. So a lot of, I do kind of, my work is a lot of blurring between comparative politics and IR, and so the comparative focus tends to focus more on European and the US, and we see in those countries that the employment of human rights is usually, human rights is something that happens in other countries, and that the violations, particularly in relation to gendered violence, are not seen as being human rights violations. And so there's this wariness about how human rights discourse might be employed in a way that was targeted at groups that were already marginalized in the global sphere, as well as groups that might be marginalized within those individual societies. So why is this a problem? Why should we care in terms of how we treat violence? And so the work that I've done on violence against women talks about how, you know, the framing of violence against women as widespread, as universal, as resting on gender inequality have been important, and that was part of what made the framing of women's rights as human rights so successful. But one of the problems with these universal framings is that it doesn't necessarily pay attention to the fact that some groups are particularly vulnerable to violence and experience different forms of violence in different ways. And so obscuring those differences can be really problematic in terms of coming up with remedies that are really effective in terms of dealing with that violence. But it's a double-edged sword to address violence, or to address difference in violence, because attention to difference can also lead to the marginalization or the culturalization of violence, which in turn may contribute to ethnocentric and deterministic understandings of violence and culture, right? So we see this emphasis of certain cultures as being particularly violent, that it's seen as kind of attached to modernity, and that modern societies being less likely to engage in gender violence, whereas more traditional being more likely. And that's not the empirical reality. The initial universal framing of it is actually a lot more accurate, that we do see gender violence occurring across all sorts of societal markers, albeit in different ways. And so it's this kind of balance in terms of recognizing that it's an issue that impacts all people and all women, but that it might affect them in different ways. And when we see this process of culturalization of gender violence happening, where certain cultures are being targeted as being particularly bad in terms of dealing with gender violence, that we see kind of a few different things happening. One is it usually doesn't make those women any safer because it feeds into xenophobic and racist discourses about those groups in a way that those policies very rarely are aimed at actually helping women, and more often used to feed into policies that end up excluding entire cultures. So let me be a little bit more specific in terms of that. The research that I have done in the past has focused on the European Union. And in the European Union, we see kind of an evolution of gender violence policy that moves in an interesting manner. In the 1980s, we see some of the first European Union documents dealing with gender violence that very much use kind of the feminist framing and the universalist discourse, that gender violence is something that impacts all people, all women, across class, across nationality, that it really truly does impact everybody, with some attention to the fact that there are certain groups that might be more vulnerable, or that there needs to be remedies that address things, such as economic dependency. So women who have lower economic resources might need additional resources in order to leave violent relationships. In the 1990s, we see them adopting the human rights framework, right? So this is when all of the UN documents and conferences start doing the frame of women's rights as human rights. And there's a little bit less attention given to the specificity of women's circumstances. Very little attention given to like how migrant women might be vulnerable to violence and coming up with solutions to address that sort of violence. And then in the 2000s, we see a shift in this discourse when we start seeing more conservative and populist politicians entering not only the leadership of individual countries, but in the European Union itself. And then we start seeing that no longer this kind of frame of violence is being universal, is impacting all these different groups, but more targeted focus that is aimed at specific groups and specific forms of violence. So instead of looking at domestic violence and sexual assault as these universal problems, there starts being a focus on genital cutting, although using the terms of female genital mutilation is what's in the documents. More attention to honor killings. And you start seeing this discourse of gender violence as being a problem that's being imported through different migrant groups. And in this we see, not ironically but hypocritically, that at the same time they're drawing this attention on the frame of being these particular groups that are vulnerable in these specific forms of violence, they start taking away the resources that were actually aimed at providing the services that might be useful for groups of people, like migrant women, like the funds that might go towards having translators or allowing those shelters to make sure that they can accommodate groups who have different sorts of legal citizenship status. And so the problem here is, one, it's contributing to some of the justifications for the xenophobic policies that were getting adopted in Europe during this time period, but it's also leads to the unraveling of some of the advances that had been made dealing with domestic violence policy and sexual assault policy, because now it's being targeted. That's not a group that's present widely in European society, but it's just something that's being imported. So I followed this trajectory in the European Union, and now I'm starting to follow that and chart that trajectory in terms of the United States. And so in the United States, we see some similar patterns. In the 1970s, we see kind of more the radical feminists doing kind of more their societal focus and less in terms of policy. In the 80s, we see some kind of gender-neutral policies that are adopted. And really, the kind of the larger advances come in the 1990s with the adoption of the Violence Against Women Act. And so, which was actually a very, even though Joe Biden gets a lot of attention for doing that, it was a bipartisan effort between himself and Senator Orrin Hatch, who is a pretty conservative Republican from Utah. Right, so they have this bipartisan legislation in 1994, very much kind of in kind of a response to some of the mobilization that was going on in the international arena, and it starts with kind of this very widespread, universal understanding of violence as impacting all different groups of women. In the 2000s, so the Violence Against Women Act ends up being renewed twice without any problems, full bipartisan support. And then a few years ago, when it came up for renewal, we start to see some shifting dynamics. In an attempt to be more inclusive, to pay attention to difference, it starts addressing some gaps in coverage for some groups that were being left out of the coverage before. And so there were 3 provisions that ended up being really controversial added to the bill to deal with violence against those in the LGBTQ community, violence to address for undocumented migrants, making sure that there were resources for those women, as well as dealing with some of the gaps for dealing with gender violence on American Indian reservations, right? So because there's some different sovereignty laws that make it actually really difficult to address violence on those reservations. And so these 3 things get added in a way to deal with difference, and it ended up being really controversial, and there are over 20 Republicans who refused to vote for it, including Marsha Blackburn, who was initially in favor of it, but because of these provisions ends up going against it. And so the clip that I have here, I actually don't have the clip, but when she's talking about it, she talks about how she shifted her support because in adding these groups, in these particular groups, she thought it was becoming an act against violence, not an act against violence of women. And the way that she phrases her statement it's seen that women of color are kind of excluded from the group of women in the way that she talks about it, that somehow by addressing women in these marginalized groups, that somehow it was no longer a Violence Against Women's Act. So we start to see a little bit in terms of that kind of resistance of kind of an inclusive understanding of it that's happening at that point. And so one of the things that then starts to happen even more recently then is we start to see some of that same dynamics in Europe of using and invoking women's human rights and gender violence as a means of oppressing particular groups. So in this case, in the case of Martha Blackburn, she was just saying that should be excluded in terms of our understanding of violence. But later it starts to shift in ways that are not necessarily new in US society, but start to be used in terms of oppressive actions. And so I wanted to talk just a little bit about some of the ways in which gender violence throughout history in the US, as well as more recently, has been used as a justification for different forms of oppression. One of that is it's been used as a justification for racial oppression. So I have up here Ida B. Wells, who was a part of the anti-lynching movement, and during that time, African-American men were being portrayed as sexual predators, and so in order to save white women, that was often the justification given for lynching. And so Ida B. Wells was really important in terms of providing an intersectional component and working for women's rights, but making sure that they weren't being co-opted to be used against African Americans. In the 1960s and 70s, we saw feminists of color, this is Angela Davis, speaking out against, in favor of the radical feminist approaches of not looking to the state for solutions to deal with gender violence, because in that case, the state was seen as one of the perpetrators of violence, and so that women of color were more likely to be sexually assaulted or beaten by police officers, even when they were trying to claim instances of violence in other realms. And so kind of that skepticism in terms of that and seeing the ways in which protecting women might be then co-opted. Here we see some of the other things in terms of this is Insight, which is a group of radical women of color who also talk about the need to address gender violence, but in ways that thinks about it in more inclusive and kind of pushes against the co-option of the state, and particularly conservative forces, to use it as a justification. Violence against women has been used as a justification for war. Mary Hawksworth talks a lot about this in talking about George W. and the Gulf Wars. There was a lot of discussion. One of the justifications for going to war then became the liberation of the Afghan women. Even though Afghan women were mobilizing and saying against the invasion, there was this rhetoric of liberation and this discussion of we need to liberate these women from a barbaric regime. And so scholars like Spivak have talked about this discourse of white men saving brown women from brown men. And so we see that justification for war, that co-option there. And then more recently, with the Trump campaign and presidency, we see what we see has happened in Europe, the justification for xenophobic policies that are made on human rights issues, right? And so just even the framing of Mexicans as being rapists, but then also LGBTQ rights, right? So after the Pulse shooting here in Orlando, right, we see Trump talking about how radical Islam does not reflect these Western values and institutions. It's anti-woman, it's anti-gay, it's anti-American. But we see that this discourse is being employed as a justification for eliminating, for changing migration policies, for taking on these xenophobic and racist framings. But at the same time that this administration is also dismantling those rights, right? So there's also this rollback. One of the first executive orders that was adopted by the Trump administration was to take away the grants that are a part of the Violence Against Women Act, right? And so this is the very same pattern that we see happening in Europe. Was there were these groups coming in that were weakening some of these equality rights at the domestic as well as the European level. At the same time, they were using women's rights and women's human rights as a justification for closing borders, for having more restrictive policies, and excluding different groups of people. And so, so this becomes a significant issue in terms of, in a number of ways. It becomes significant because the question often becomes who is being protected by these policies, right? If it's all about protecting women from violence and no women are being protected and some women are actually being made more vulnerable and more precarious, their position more precarious, then this becomes a big issue. And the fact that social justice movements can have their claims co-opted in ways to do some damage becomes something to pay attention to. And so how do we resist this? How do we resist, how can this be resisted? And so a lot of the work that I've done has focused on kind of the need for more intersectional approaches and understanding, not only of policy, but also of social mobilization, in which we really need to think about how the framing of certain issues, who is it being aimed at, right? So if we talk about the safety of women, the safety of which women is being talked about. And when we talk about policy, what type of impact is it having? If we have policy that is aimed at protecting women, but is actually being used to build law enforcement approaches that are then utilized to oppress certain groups, that's problematic. If it's being used as justification for xenophobic policies that end up hurting women of that group, then it's not necessarily resulting in anything and seen as an advance in those areas. We also need to think about this in the context of social movements, right? That there's been a lot of debate and critique levied against the women's marches that arose. For example, the imagery of women engaging with police officers, putting on the hats on and talking about that it was safe marches, that the marches had no violence, and the kind of privilege that comes in terms of that hasn't always been the experience for women of color. For some women of color, their interactions with the police have been more violent, and so that issue of safety for whom? And while these marches are about a range of issues, if women's rights is human rights, as was one of the frame that we saw on some of those signs, we need to think about whether or not that is really accomplishing what it needs to be. And so intersectionality in terms of social movement means connecting different movements, right? One of the arguments then is that if there truly is going to be a movement that's against violence against women, that movement needs to be linked to movements that are aimed at racial justice, right? That if it's really going to be aimed at eliminating violence for all women, then that needs to link with the different groups that are experiencing violence in different ways, sometimes at the hand of the state.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. So this is a paper that I've been working on with Karina Powell in the sociology department here at UCF. And I'd like to start out with perhaps a rather lengthy quote from John Keegan's famous book, A History of Warfare. And to just put this into perspective, this is a very widely cited book. I checked this morning on Google Scholar, something like 1,800 plus citations are showing up in the book. But I'd like to use this quote to frame it. I'd like to walk through it a little bit just to be clear about why I'm using this quote, because some people often misunderstand the point that I'm trying to get across here. So he writes that women had followed the drum, nursed the wounded, tended to the fields and herded the flocks when the man of the family has followed his leader, had even dug the trenches for men to defend and labored in the workshops to send them their weapons. Women, however, do not fight. They rarely fight among themselves and never, in any military sense, fight men. If warfare is as old as history and universal as mankind, we must now enter the supremely important limitation that it is an entirely masculine activity. Now, the reason why I want to use this quote to start the presentation isn't to try to, disparage what Keegan is doing and point out that the quote is, of course, just empirically wrong. Women have obviously participated in warfare in a variety of different ways, including fighting in the front lines and fighting in the trenches, and some of the panelists that you'll have this afternoon have kind of been at the forefront in some really good recent literature that points to this. The purpose of using this quote is to indicate that this is a very common perception, and ultimately the point of my presentation is going to be to suggest that these sorts of perceptions matter. So regardless of whether what Keegan is saying here is true or not true, the most important point that I want to get across with using this quote is that this is obviously a very important idea that people have, and this is going to be an important contributor to how people feel about things like women serving as leaders in times of conflict. So ultimately, what this is going to be is a story about leadership. So not necessarily people fighting in the trenches, fighting and dying in warfare, but actually acting as leaders in times of conflict. So I'd like to start with some basic foundations. A lot of it actually comes from outside of political science, from a range of disciplines, history, management studies, sociology, etc. One thing that I'd like to start off with is just this basic idea of perceptions of what makes a leader good. And ultimately, what the literature has found is that the same qualities that people usually identify in a strong leader are also what we generally identify as masculine traits, things like being direct, being aggressive, and being very decisive. Qualities that are generally seen as being more feminine are usually what we associate with being weak leaders, like being more communal and not taking very decisive actions. Well, these are going to be very important because when we're looking for leaders, whether it's in terms of leading a country at a time of war or actually just acting as a manager in some sort of business, these sorts of perceptions are going to be important in how we evaluate both the character of the leader that we have, also their abilities to actually lead, and ultimately their performance. So looking at a few different pieces of literature, I'll point to Eagly's work in management studies that indicate that female managers across a range of different industries, regardless of other qualifications, are generally evaluated more negatively by those that are working with them and under them. Garcia Romero and Lopez Zafra, they expanded upon this to show that we actually see some changes in the degree to which this is true based on the industry. And what they find is that industries that are generally seen as being more masculine, you actually see this become worse. So in the auto industry, for example, female managers are going to be evaluated much more negatively than female managers in something like the fashion industry. Now there's still going to be that gap where females are going to be evaluated more negatively in what we might think of as more feminine industries, but it ultimately is going to become much worse in industries that we generally associate with being more masculine. Now tying this back to the Keegan quote, if we're thinking about something like war, and we have this idea that warfare is in fact a supremely masculine endeavor, this is obviously going to have important implications for how we're going to evaluate women as potential leaders. So a few studies that I think are relevant here is first with Biernat et al. Find that when you follow soldiers going through basic training in the Army, what they find is that female drill sergeants are actually evaluated more negatively, and this actually worsens over time. So the soldiers are in the armed forces for longer, it tends to get worse. Archer more recently has found similar results in looking at the Marine Corps. And ultimately, Alexander and Anderson also find that people also have these sorts of attitudes towards female candidates more generally, so when we're looking at political office. And then Lawless's work, and she's done a variety of different studies on this, shows that in matters related to war in particular, the general public, especially in the U.S., generally views female candidates as being less capable of handling the affairs related to the military. Now, connecting this to empirical studies that have looked at conflict, and there's an endless amount of, or an increasing amount of scholarship that has empirically looked at the association between a range of gender dynamics and conflict. And generally what has been found is that as women's empowerment increases, countries generally become more peaceful. They're less likely to start interstate disputes, they're less likely to have civil wars, etc. I want to focus on these because they point to a potential paradox in which even though countries that have higher levels of gender equality seem to be more peaceful, countries with female chief executives are typically found to be significantly more likely to initiate interstate disputes. So first, with Marshall and Marshall, they find that countries with female chief executives are more likely to initiate militarized interstate disputes. Caprioli and Boyer, later on, looking at episodes of international crises, found that countries with female heads of state were actually more likely to be the first side to use force in an international crisis. And then Cohen and Fulton later on have pointed to a kind of conditional effect where it seems that female chief executives are generally more aggressive in conditions in which their country has less gender equality. And ultimately, I'm going to be making a similar argument. Cohen and Fulton, they ultimately only look at 22 countries, mainly European or in the United States, developed democracies basically is their entire sample, where I think it's actually only going to be the case where they have one instance in which the female head of state actually led a war. So ultimately, one thing that I'm going to be doing is expanding beyond this and looking at a global sample, and then also looking at not just female executives as initiators of conflict, but also the degree to which their countries are actually going to be targeted in conflict. So, so we have kind of this paradox where women's status more generally doesn't seem to match up with how countries behave when they have a female chief executive in power. And this quote from Capri and Boyer here is kind of the explanation, like why people think this is going to be the case. So they like the female leaders who have risen to power through a male-defined and male-dominated political environment may well need to be more aggressive. To appear and act feminine and therefore weak would be political suicide. So this gets back to what I was discussing earlier, which is the basic idea of what makes a strong leader. And if you're a leader who is ultimately doing the communal thing and not being decisive and not being aggressive, ultimately you can appear to be weak, and ultimately this could end up costing you in terms of your domestic political capital or ability to maintain office. So one thing that I want to do to illustrate the general argument that I'm going to use here is perhaps an oversimplification of a bargaining game that we would use in war. So first, this line that I'm going to use here, just think of this as a range of potential outcomes that each side could potentially have. So we often hear people talk about getting your piece of the pie or your share of the pie. So I'll use that as an example. So think of this line as being a pie. So first, with country A, I'm going to use the solid arrow to represent the maximum amount of pie that country A thinks they could possibly get in some sort of dispute with country B. And country B, obviously, is going to have their own preferences. Now, country A, ideally, they would be able to get everything, which is what's going to be reflected with the arrow being here on the far right. But if that's going to be the case, country B is obviously not going to have anything. Now, the dashed arrows here, this is basically representing what we might think of as the worst case scenario that a leader can go home with. So there might be some sort of dispute, some sort of negotiation going on with a foreign country. Ultimately, you might have what you want to get, you might have what you think is the maximum you can get, and then also there's going to be what you think is the minimal acceptable outcome that you can bring back to your domestic constituents. So the idea here is going to be that if we have a female executive in country A, this basically the bottom line, like the absolute worst case scenario that you can come home with, it's going to move towards the right. And if they're going to come home with a deal that's going to be worse than a female executive would have had under similar circumstances, they can expect to be punished with it. It could be the case that they basically have to get the maximum in order to be able to be seen as having basically won in the negotiation. Now, this is where folks like Caprioli and Boyer and Cohen and Fulton have kind of stopped. Like they've looked at it specifically in terms of what's going on with the female executive side of the equation. But there's also another side to the conflict, the country that they're actually going to get involved with the dispute. And this is going to be country B. So now with country B, we have that leader, a male leader, potentially being in the unenviable position where they're negotiating with a woman, and they have to think about how they're going to appear to their domestic constituents if they, say, are had by a woman in a negotiation. So just as we saw that dashed line move to the right for country A, for country B, we're ultimately going to see this dashed arrow move to the left where they're going to want a better outcome for their country. Now, right now, the way this is set up, we have this gap here. This tells us that there's enough space there for a negotiation to be successful. Like there's an outcome that can be acceptable to both sides. where country A will be happy with what they're getting, and country B can walk away with even more than the minimum that they think they can get out of it. But once you add in these gender dynamics, we might see these preferences start to sneak over the left a little bit. And in this case, we would see a much smaller likelihood that there's going to be some sort of negotiated settlement or an avoidance of conflict. It could be the case that this moves even further to the left. And in this particular case, there is no acceptable outcome for either side. Now, ultimately, what I'm going to be arguing is that the degree to which these dashed arrows are going to be moving are based on different levels of the domestic gender environment. Now, there are some, snippets of different cases that we can point to. So one example that I'll use here, this is a commonly used quote in this literature from Pakistani President Yahya Khan, where he's referring to Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. If that woman thinks she's going to cow me down, I refuse to take it. And the idea here is, had he been in a dispute or in a negotiation with a male head of state, then ultimately he might have behaved differently and conflict might have been able to be avoided. So ultimately, there are three hypotheses that we pursue here. So first, and this is one that has appeared in the literature before, and this is that female executives will be more likely to initiate disputes. The second is that male executives will be more likely to target female executives. And then third, these trends should subside as women's status improves in the initiating state. Now, before getting into like a more formal quantitative analysis, I wanted to walk through some basic statistics just to illustrate what's going on in the data. So here, the left axis, the vertical axis, is referring to the probability of dispute initiation. And what this is looking at as, and this actually isn't a probability, this is a percentage. So this is the percentage of years in which a leader is in power that they initiate a dispute with another country. And for female executives here, it's just under 4%. It's like 3.85% or so. For male executives, it's a little bit lower. Now, in what I'm showing you here, this is looking at very low levels of women's social rights on this indicator from the Singernelli and Richards Human Rights data set, here represented with the 0, 1, 2, and 3. On this scale, a 0 refers to countries in which women effectively have no rights. They don't have protections codified in law, and they are certainly not going to be seeing things enforced. So think countries like Saudi Arabia. A 1 on this scale would indicate that there are some legal protections, at least in writing, but in practice, they might not be carried out to the fullest degree. The 2 would reflect that, in general, there are both strong legal protections, and they're usually going to be enforced. And the 3 would represent where you actually do have strong written legislation that are protecting women, and the government is doing a proactive job in respecting it. So here, when we're at low levels of women's status, we see female executives do appear to be disproportionately more likely to enter interstate disputes. If we go to 1, so improving the gender environment a little bit, we see something very similar. So the probability doesn't change much for female executives. It actually does dip a little bit for male executives. But once we go higher on this scale for women's social rights, we see these probabilities decline very steeply, and they also switch in terms of how the chief executives are behaving. So when you get to a 2 on this scale, female executives are suddenly far less likely than male executives to initiate an interstate dispute. And if we get to a category of 3, and I wouldn't draw too many inferences from this because there simply aren't very many countries in which you're being coded as a 3 on this scale, and there are even fewer cases in which you have female executives leading those countries, but there are literally no instances where a female chief executive initiated a dispute when their country was ranked at the highest level of this social rights scale. And then putting this in kind of absolute terms, overall, there are over 1,100 militarized interstate disputes in this data set. There are 38 that were initiated by female heads of state. There were 36 that targeted female heads of state. There are 0 in which a female head of state, their country targeted another country that is headed by women. Now, ultimately, I look at this quantitatively. My unit of analysis is directed dyad year. I'm limiting this to politically relevant directed dyads. The dependent variable, here I'm looking at militarized interstate disputes, or what we might refer to as MIDs. I'm going to report results where I'm looking at all militarized interstate disputes, which includes things that are just a threat of conflict, like not necessarily actually seeing folks firing at each other. I also run models on higher levels of conflict, including war. What tends to happen is that as you go higher with the level of conflict, the results that I'm going to show you here actually become exaggerated, and the gap between male and female executives actually grows even more pronounced. The independent variables that I'm looking at here, first, the female chief executive. Next, the percent of women in parliament. I'm using the Sigrinelli and Richards Women's Status Indicator, social, economic, and political. For the sake of brevity here, I'm going to focus on social in this presentation. And then ultimately, I'm going to be interacting this executive variable with these different status interactions in the percent women in parliament term. In this way, we can see how female executives, how their countries are behaving at different levels of these status indicators. And then I won't talk much about the controls, won't really talk about them at all, but if anyone's curious about the model more generally, we can talk about this a little more later on. I won't bore you all with the dreaded coefficient table. Again, if anyone's interested, we can talk about that in the Q&A session. But what I wanted to show here is what actually happens with probabilities. So this is the probability of conflict initiation based on the sex of the chief executive, and this reports how those probabilities change based on the percent of women in their parliaments. So the black lines here, the black diamonds are referring to countries in which there's a female chief executive. Those whiskers going up and down from it, these are confidence intervals. And then the gray lines and the gray circles, these are referring to the probability of conflict initiation for male executives. Now the takeaway point from this graph, there are two big things that I'll point to. First, when you go to the left side of this, so when you get below 10% women in parliament, here we actually see that female chief executives are significantly more likely than male chief executives to initiate a conflict. As you increase women's participation in parliament, we see a large decrease in the conflict propensity of female chief executives, whereas it doesn't really make much of a difference for male chief executives. We see something similar looking at this women's social rights indicator from the Sigrinelli and Richards human rights data set, where when you're looking at countries with low levels of women's status, if you have a female chief executive in those countries, we see a very pronounced and statistically significant difference where female executives are far more likely to initiate an interstate dispute. As you increase women's status in that country, ultimately we see that there are any differences between them drowns out. And then by the time you get up to this highest level here at a 3, we see that female chief executives are actually significantly less likely to initiate an interstate dispute. Now, looking at who's being targeted, this is looking at instances in which the target state is either has a male executive or a female executive. And here, at least in terms of percent women in parliament, we see that this is even more pronounced. So male executives that are governing countries with low levels of women in parliament, they're significantly more likely to target a country with a mid if that country is being led by a female executive. And again, as you get far to the right, as you increase women's participation in parliament here, eventually it becomes negative and significant. And then finally, looking at targets in terms of women's social rights, here these overlap with each other. There's not really a takeaway point. There aren't significant differences to speak of here. So the conclusions here, first, female executives are generally more likely to initiate a dispute and are likely targets for male executives, but conditionality is key. And what really seems to be important here isn't necessarily who's governing the country, but ultimately what's going on inside of their country in terms of gender dynamics and gender norms. And the results also point to women's empowerment as potentially being a very important determinant of more peaceful interactions between states. Thank you.
Great, so we have about 35 minutes. So let's take some questions, 2 or 3 for any of our panelists, and then I'll give them an opportunity to respond.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ricardo. I'm a PhD student here at UCF for the Disability Studies program. Dr. Cohen, thank you so much for the presentation. Very interesting. I have a question related to your research. I believe you indicated that you are conducting kind of a nationwide survey. There are thousands of them, I believe, in order to highlight the major points of your research. My question is, are you planning to account for the relatively large Haitian population that lives in the Dominican Republic, which is like about probably like 500,000 people, probably like 30% of them are females, and or like let's say female fighters from El Salvador who maybe migrate to the state at some point. The people in Haiti, they go back and forth, especially in that border area. So are you planning to include...
May I have your attention, please? A fire emergency has been reported in the building. While this is being done,